Hi, Charlie. Wait, actually, sorry, Jeff. I've never started one of these before. Um, Wait, okay, I'll just keep going. Um, Hi, Charlie. We are going to be discussing today Iraq and Iran electricity and gas cutoffs. So I was going to kick us off by just diving straight into what we saw happen earlier this week, where the Iraqi Ministry of Electricity said that the country is going to be facing a shortage of electricity after cutting off gas supplies from Iran over the issue of Iraq's non payment of the debt that the two countries have been grappling with for a long time. So, this is something that has been a long-standing issue between the two countries. We wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the political and social and security implications of this issue. Um, so I thought it might be useful to just talk a little bit about some of the history of this dependence that Iraq has on Iran for a lot of its electricity and for its natural gas. Um, Really, when you look at these two neighboring countries, which have, of course, a complicated history, Iraq has been sourcing electricity and natural gas from Iran for many, many years, especially in the south, where there are even closer political ties between the Iranian government and the Iraqi government, especially those local governments in the south of Iraq. Um, Iraq has really only had a Ministry of Electricity since really in the last 20 years. I think it was 2003. And Iraq has historically especially since 2003 and the coalition invasion and the ouster of Saddam Hussein, has had a capacity issue in terms of its ability to produce enough electricity for the population. Its sort of ability to generate enough electricity for the population. Demand has always been higher than supply, really, since the Ministry of Electricity has been recording the numbers. So, this has led to a dependence on making sure that Iraq can import what it needs from neighboring Iran. So they import roughly a third of um, its electricity supply from Iran in the form of just directly plugging into its electricity grid and also bringing in natural gas resources to fuel its natural gas fueled power plants. So there's a lot of implications here that we could unpack. But I thought, Charlie, what's one of the
It,
first things that's on your mind when you're reading this news about the Iraqi Ministry of Electricity sort of cutting off these imports?
Indeed, the first thing that comes to my mind is the 2018 protests that happened in a similar situation uh, when Iran cut off gas supplies. At that point, there were protests that were particularly bad across southern Iraq in Basra, in Najaf, and but just throughout southern Iraq in particular, that got bad enough that they had to actually call in security reinforcements and um, security forces from counterterrorism duties, from counter Islamic State, and from other priorities that the Iraqi state has to deal with. Additionally, it also uh, the protesters in Basra blamed Iran for not for the cutoff of the power. So there was a significant spike in anti-Iranian violence in particular. I recall they burned down the Iranian consulate in Basra, and there were also attacks on the offices and political party offices affiliated with Iranian-backed Shia militia groups, and that kind of portended a wave of violence of reprisals by the Shia militias, specifically targeting Southern activists in Iraq. So we had a wave of assassinations in 2018. So there are some fairly serious security implications from the electricity shortages that we're talking about here, that could transpire this year as well, particularly given we're talking about multiple overlapping shortages this time, not just electricity, but we're also talking about food staple shortages from the war in Ukraine. We're talking about water shortages, which have always been a problem in Iraq, but we've had severe drought this year. We've had other, other key water shortages. So we're talking about overlapping issues that are coming to fore here, not just the electricity. So that fact that we're talking about those overlapping issues means that we have a fairly high likelihood, in my estimation, of seeing significant protests this summer, and especially in the South, but it may not be limited to just the South, especially if we talk about these other overlapping shortages. So,
Yeah,
um,
that's a really good point and a very concerning outlook for Iraqi stability that you're seeing. And certainly it does have sort of seasonal upticks when demand for electricity goes up, which happens in the summer. That makes sense that if the electricity is not there, and we talked about the fact that there's always a gap between demand and supply within the Iraqi system, that naturally I can see what you mean in terms of how that will sort of push people to be upset. And then, of course, this is happening at a time in which Iraq doesn't have a formed government, which is complicating the issue, right? The actual government statement this week about the cutoff of the gas supplies from Iran sort of cited the fact that the Iraqi government right now is not actually formed. It doesn't have the authority to make the payment of it's between 1.6 and 1.7 billion dollars that is due to Iran for some of that electricity supply and for some of those gas supplies. Um, because we are in this place where since October 2021 elections in Iraq, we're several months out from that, 8 or 9 months out from that, and we don't yet have a government formed. And there's been a really tumultuous process of trying to build various blocks and coalitions that can agree on who's going to be in that next government. So it's certainly highlighting the issue of political instability within Iraq, and also one of the negative impacts of lacking a cohesive government is this direct impact it has on the government's ability to make payments and to ensure that Iraq has the type of supplies that it needs. Um, I think also you were talking about the security issues, and one sort of related issue that we could go into is how the United States it plays into this, and maybe I wanted to just mention the U.S. Relationship to this with respect to sanctions waivers, but then maybe you could talk a little bit about sort of the tension between the United States and Iran with respect to Iraq, because there's all sorts of security issues there related to the
oh,
militias
yes.
and stuff. But I wanted to mention just that the United States does play a role in the economics of this, because the United States has been issuing for years waivers on the sanctions that it has on the import of Iranian natural gas. It's been wavering the Iraqi government's purchases of Iranian gas, so it has not been sanctioning Iraq for doing that. But it continues to say and put pressure on Baghdad that they need to stop importing Iranian gas, that those are sanctioned products, and that Iraq needs to find other sources. Iraq needs to build a more robust electricity grid, and the United States has offered sort of talks with companies in Europe and in the United States, General Electric and others, to sort of try and devise ways in the long term that Iraq can build up its electricity grid so that it's not dependent on Iran. But the reality is it's really, really, really challenging to see how Iraq, when it's dependent for roughly a third of its natural gas and electricity supply from Iran, it's really difficult to see how they're going to be able to sort of disrupt that. But I wondered if you could go into just a little bit of the security dynamics between the United States and Iran as it relates to Iraq.
Sure, and those security dynamics are pretty complicated, to say the least. Iranian Shia militia groups are still continuing to target. Well, Iranian-sponsored Shia militia groups are continuing to target U.S. forces in Iraq, at least periodically. Um, and we did see somewhat of an uptick in that during the last protest, during the 2018 protests, when pro-Iranian militias essentially tried to frame the electricity protesters as US agents or agents of US influence. In particular, one instance where a US activist had met with American officials in the Basra consulate. They specifically targeted her as an agent of America. So this Iran U.S. proxy conflict is kind of in the, I mean, not proxy, but this Iran U.S. conflict is kind of in that background, and certainly plays a role in these security dynamics, um, especially given the uncertainty around Shia militias and their future role in the Iraqi government. And and I wanted to kind of kick this question over to you. Do you think that protests could have a shaping influence on the the nature of Iraq's future government, as far as, if Shia militias become involved, with protesters again, clash with protesters again, go after activists again, could that have an impact on the future shape that the Iraqi government takes on the political side of things?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I do think, depending on what we see in terms of protest activity from Iraqis who are demanding basic resources from the government, I think it could have an impact on government formation. Um, One, because if we do see a lot of um, resource scarcity driven protests that turn into anti-government protests, demands for reform, demands for basic goods, that is going to um, one, sort of fuel the rhetoric by this unique block of independents that won their seats in the October elections, um, who are sort of loosely a part of the October 2019 civil society protests that were demanding for reform within the Iraqi government. So there's only a small group of these independents, and some of them are affiliated with a group called Imtidad, and they are going to be um, really see their own rhetoric and their own demands for forming a government that responds to Iraqis' needs. They're going to see that rhetoric really propped up and sort of put more on the national stage if Iraq is dealing with a lot of anti government protests. It's going to directly sort of provide fodder for these independents saying, look, this is why we campaigned as we did. This is why we are glad that we're in government. This is why we need to be a prominent part of the next government that has a majority in parliament. We need to be able to answer to Iraqis' needs. That's one impact. Another, I think, um, certainly it also has the possibility of further delaying the government formation process, because it becomes a bit of a political hot potato. If you have significant protests, who wants to be prime minister in charge of the country, and you have to deal with that. You have to answer people's demands with a very difficult hand economically and financially. So it's certainly, that's also a possibility, is that it'll just further delay the government formation talks, even though that seems almost counterintuitive, because having a government could, in theory, sort of help Baghdad respond to these needs. One other thing that's worth mentioning is that um, the global economic and financial picture right now has one of the facets of it is these higher energy prices. Everyone is aware of this, just at the gas pumps all over the world. Um, but and this is really important for a government like Iraq, which I think 89% of its government revenue comes straight from energy exports. It's one of the most energy rich countries in the world, as most people know. Um, so Iraq has received higher than initially anticipated government revenue this year. That's a good thing for government finances. But the problem is that doesn't that hasn't historically translated into having the type of money that Baghdad needs to sort of respond effectively and efficiently to people's demands for basic resources, basic goods, basic services. And that has a whole lot to do with corruption and structural inefficiencies within the Iraqi government. So um, I mentioned that because it's it's an interesting silver lining for Iraq's government finances this year, but the fact that it is unlikely to translate into being able to sort of solve these issues like the natural gas cutoffs, the fact that Iraq seemingly is unable to make a payment of 1.7 billion, even though it's making an incredible amount of money from oil exports, that just points to the fact that this is a really serious issue that is not going to be easily solved. And that's one reason why the government formation process is just taking such a long time.
Indeed, and to kind of add to that, one thing is that with Iraq in particular, security crises and other and political crises tend to outlast the positive the increases in oil prices, which are obviously, as you know, prone to booms and busts in the energy market. They're boom and bust prone, so they can have really good, a really good period of time, but it tends to not be long enough to necessarily extricate themselves from these very difficult problems that they face.
Yep,
So um,
definitely.
that's
And
another
the,
thing that is a key factor to consider.
definitely. And one of the last points I wanted to mention about this is um, that the issue of this non-payment, um, Iraq not being able to pay for these gas supplies from Iran also highlights some economic instability within Iran, and a higher demand than supply for natural gas and electricity within Iran, which is part of the issue between the Iraqi and the Iranian governments over making sure that Iraq and Iran both have what they need. We have seen over the last couple years, Iran has cut off gas supplies temporarily to Iraq when it is also facing surging demand within its own borders. And right now in Iran, there have been over the last month sporadic protests related to economic grievances that have turned into anti-government protests. And part of that, one big factor in that is relative resource scarcity in places, especially like Southwest Iran, which is historically under resourced. So it's it's important, I think, to think about that implication as well, because this issue and the fact that Iran is willing to cut this off, one, because they're not being paid, but two, because they need some of the electricity and gas supply for their own domestic demand, I think points to that economic strain in Iran, which is a little bit harder to get an accurate picture on sometimes with the sort of open source information that we have access to.
Yep, and that's, we talked earlier about overlapping crises. There's a similar dynamic at play, from what I understand, with food imports.
Hmm.
Iraq tries to import food from Iran, but Iran is facing the same food shortages and problems that Iraq is currently facing, so they're less inclined, and they may have put a ban on exports, if I recall correctly, but they're certainly less inclined to export what they have, given the local conditions within Iran. And as we know, Iraq is facing a worse than expected wheat harvest due to climate change, among other things, as well as drought. So we have those overlapping resource scarcity dynamics to deal with.
Definitely. Well, I think we've covered some of the broad points related to this issue, and we'll see sort of what happens next with this issue between Iran and Iraq. Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you, Emily.